So, as was mentioned, when the Christchurch shooting happened, the terrorist had names of several Serbian figures on his weapons and was playing the Serbian folk song, Karadzic, Lead Your Serbs, which in the far-right online communities that he was frequenting, it's known by the name Remove Kebab, and in his manifesto he identified himself as a fascist and also as a kebab removalist. He had taken a lot of influence from the perpetrators of the Bosnian genocide, and this was something that I wasn't especially familiar with. I was a child when this was happening and vaguely aware that there was some violence overseas, but didn't know a lot about it. So one of the things that I've done recently is started to research into this conflict and look at the connections between what happened in Bosnia in the 1990s and the ideology of the Western far right today, including the Christchurch shooter. And I've started this series of videos on YouTube. There's 2 parts and there is a 3rd part yet to come. I would recommend having a look at that if video is a good way for you to absorb information, or if you're more of someone who prefers to read. There's a couple of books I recommend in there. Genocide in Bosnia by Michael Sells, and another one by Norman Cigar. But I look at in this video series, and it's covered in these books as well, how that genocide happened. And people don't just get up one day and start committing genocide. The first aspect of it is the dehumanization of a people, the othering of a people. And if you read about what was happening in that part of the world in the 1980s and early 1990s, it is shocking how much of it will be familiar to you if you listen to a lot of, not just the far right, but even some more mainstream politicians, particularly in Europe. The perpetrators of the Bosnian genocide alleged that there was a almost deliberate plot by Muslims to outbreed them and then take over. They also would talk about Muslims being radical terrorists. They would claim that Muslim men would take multiple wives in order to have more babies and outbreed the Christian Serbs, which was not the way that people had marriages in that region, but they would claim this anyway. And through years of the sustained propaganda coming from politicians, coming from intellectuals, they were able to turn the Serbian population against the Muslim population, even though these were people who had been living side by side happily in what was actually a very multicultural region, and it wasn't that Muslims were recent immigrants to the Balkans. They'd been there for centuries. So I started looking into this and looking at how this had influenced the shooter. And like I say, you find so much rhetoric that you will hear today from other politicians and from the far right, and that sort of moves into the second part of the question, which is the local far right. I began following them probably a couple of years before the shooting. I can't remember exactly when I started following the far right, but I'd seen things that were happening overseas and thought it would be useful just to keep an eye on what was going on here. So we saw things like the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville in 2017. Before that, of course, the rise to power of Donald Trump, who was promising to ban Muslims from entering the United States. And we saw numerous figures become popular on new social media platforms like YouTube. To give a couple of really prominent examples, Stefan Molyneux and Lauren Southern, who in 2018 came to New Zealand. The fact that they included New Zealand as part of their speaking tour showed that they had an audience here. People were paying nearly $100 a ticket to come and see them speak. And if you're not familiar with the ideas that those two were promoting, Lauren Southern had made a video, I'd rather not call it a documentary, but she had made a video called The Great Replacement about this idea that there's a plan to replace white people with non-white people. And Stefan Molyneux promoted discredited pseudoscience about race and intelligence. When the Royal Commission report on the Christchurch shooting came out, one of the things we learned from that is that much of the shooter's radicalization came via YouTube. And he had donated to both the company that employed Lauren Southern at the time and also to Stefan Molyneux. So it's more than likely that he was watching their content and watched Lauren Southern's documentary on the Great Replacement. We talk about these sort of seedy underbellies like 8chan as a source of far-right extremism, but just in the same way that people don't wake up one day and participate in a genocide, people don't wake up one day and say, oh, what's the most hateful place I can find on the internet? The radicalization starts on mainstream social media platforms. YouTube has been particularly bad because until quite recently, their algorithm was designed to keep people watching as long as possible, the idea being that you have advertising at the beginning of each video or in the middle, so the longer people stay watching YouTube, the more money YouTube's going to make. So what this meant was YouTube's algorithm learned to serve people increasingly radical and increasingly hateful content. So you might start out by watching a reasonably mainstream conservative, like something from Fox News, and then that would finish and it would autoplay something a little bit more extreme, and it would go from there to perhaps Jordan Peterson, and then you'd watch Jordan Peterson talking about how there's no structural oppression, there's only a ever-existing dominance hierarchy. And then YouTube would then play you Stefan Molyneux, who would tell you, well, yes, white people are at the top of the dominance hierarchy because they are inherently more intelligent, which is nonsense, but this is the ideas that he was propagating. And then you might get to Lauren Southern, and then you might get to people even worse. And if you're in a space where you're watching a lot of this content, you may then seek out other people who think the same way as you do, and that's when you end up on these places like 8chan and become further radicalized. The other thing that really stood out to me from reading the Royal Commission report, and this again brings us back to the Bosnian genocide, is that the shooter had travelled in the Balkan region in 2017. And we don't know for sure where he went, but he visited places of historical interest. And while he didn't, at least not that we know of, he didn't meet with any far-right extremists in that region, it was while he was there that he first contacted the Bruce Rifle Club in Dunedin, where he practiced his shooting and inquired about becoming a member. And the Royal Commission report notes that this was the first indication that he was going to go on to commit violence, was that while he was travelling in a part of the world where just 25 years ago there'd been a genocide of Muslims, it was then he made contact with a gun club in New Zealand before coming here and, as we know, making his plans and carrying out the atrocity that he did. In addition to those overseas-based YouTubers like Stefan Molyneux and Lauren Southern are both from Canada, although Lauren Southern has now moved to Australia, which is far closer to me than I would like her to be, unfortunately. And is trying to reinvent herself as a mainstream conservative, and we need to be very vigilant of that, because we've seen what she was promoting and where that's led to. There are less popular but still significant YouTube personalities here in New Zealand promoting similar rhetoric. And because they're in New Zealand and we're a very small country, their audiences don't look very big, but they are bringing in a particularly New Zealand audience and moving into some in-person organising as well. 4 weeks before the Christchurch shooting, a man who lives just outside of Christchurch named Lee Williams stood in Cathedral Square, which I looked it up. It's 2.4 kilometres from Al Noor Masjid, about a half-hour walk. He stood in Cathedral Square and he made a video of himself promoting the Great Replacement theory.
But that's what they do, these lefties and these social justice warriors. But you know, bringing this alien religious ideology into New Zealand is not going to be doing any favours to New Zealand. I mean, there's plenty of empirical evidence in Europe. I mean, the empirical evidence is overwhelming of how well this enrichment is doing in Britain and in France, Belgium, Holland, Germany, Sweden, Denmark. The evidence is all over Western Europe, but the governments of Western Europe still continue to bring in these enrichers. And let's face it, in Europe, these enrichers are 90% fighting age young men. That's what they're bringing into Europe. That's the absolute insanity of them European leaders. These traitors of Merkel and Macron and Theresa May. Radical Islam is going to come to New Zealand. It's coming here. And, you know, and I think we've got to stop it, because...
In the description of that video, he asked viewers to get out and do your bit to save your country from Islamization. Now, it's unlikely that the shooter watched this video, and we'll never know, but this was the call to action that this man was promoting. That video is still online, despite numerous reports to YouTube for hateful content. And Lee is still online and has amassed a significant following with about 14,000 subscribers. A week before the shooting, another New Zealand-based YouTuber who lives here in Auckland, Carol Seiki, uploaded a video claiming that there was an Islamic takeover of the West.
The Islamic takeover. Well, we've all seen that on telly, haven't we?
And that people in Britain, France and Germany feel like they've been invaded, and in her words, because they have been invaded.
They have been invaded.
She then said,
when you see what's happening around us, the amount of mosque and Islamic centres and schools going up, you have to wonder how far away they are.
Alleging that this supposed Islamic invasion of the West had extended to New Zealand just 1 week before the shooting. And again, that video is still up. Her channel is still up. She continues to make content. Both of those people are at protest. Probably as we speak right now, there is a protest organised by the far right outside Auckland Museum, and Carol Seiki will be there.
And I have many reports.
We're just currently waiting on a couple of speakers to arrive, as they are running a little bit late. So we've just got a public service announcement from Carol Seiki at this point in time. While we wait.
Every age on this planet receiving a vaccine.
Another protest is happening in Christchurch, and likely Lee Williams will be there.
And when they get here, they
Hi there, this is
split
across
off.
the
There
Rubicon.
wasn't just one aeroplane there.
Today is the
They had
20th
other
of March. I'm
airplanes
here
with them in that scanning thing, so they couldn't be watched coming into New Zealand.
or
So
near the Bridge of
they were trying to
Remembrance,
hide the amount
and
of plane
Kyle has
traffic
given a
that's coming into
speech
New
here.
Zealand. If the
I've just
government's
gave
going
my
to go
speech,
that far to hide
but
information,
I'm not going to put it on my
then
channel
how can we
because
trust them about
I'd
other
get banned.
stuff? And that's,
So anyway,
that's
here's
what I started
Kyle.
thinking. I mean, I've been a bit of a questioner my whole life.
Kyle,
I've always
should I
had
say.
my own opinion.
I know I've only got a couple of minutes left, so I just want to talk about the concept of stochastic terrorism, which is that if you have this kind of hateful rhetoric going on, it increases the probability that violence will happen. So we can't look at something like the Christchurch shooting and say, oh, that happened because of people like, well, of people like Lee Williams and Carol Saiki. They would be incredibly irate if we tried to pin it on them. But what we can say is that when you have content like that in the media, it increases the probability of violence occurring. I make the comparison with climate change. We know that climate change is going to increase the amount of severe weather events like hurricanes, but you can't point at a hurricane and say, oh, this particular hurricane was caused by climate change. And in the same way, we can't point at an event like the Christchurch shooting and say, oh, that was caused by these particular YouTubers. Although in this instance, the fact that he had donated to two of them does make a bit more of a link there. And I think just like with climate change, when it comes to the far right and Islamophobia, a problem is harmful emissions. There are people on YouTube, on Facebook, emitting these harmful ideologies and this hatred, and that's an important part of the fight against Islamophobia, is reducing those emissions